In this episode, we talk about the different categories of the ordinances, statutes, decrees, law, and whether Paul really meant that all of the Torah was actually thrown out, and if it's just one law. Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Torah Tuesday, episode 9. I want to continue to remind you to submit your questions in the comments below on Facebook, on YouTube, Twitter. Use hashtag Torah Tuesday to get your questions highlighted on a future episode. In this week, we have a pretty interesting Torah portion, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the word bechukotai. So in Hebrew, the word bechukotai is translated as in my statutes. And so this is something that gets very confused in the believing world around us. When we look at the word law, when we look at what's translated as law into the English, we many times assume, and based on many different doctrinal positions, they get translated as one lumped group. So when Paul in the New Testament talks about the law and the law was done away with, or he talks about the decrees or the statutes or ordinances, that it's always lumped into one big category. So he must be referring to just the Old Testament or just the Torah. And we know that Torah means instruction, so it doesn't actually even mean law. But then within the word law, when you dissect the Hebrew words behind them, there's much more than one category of law itself. And in this week's Torah portion, the word bechukotai comes from the root word hukat. And hukim are these ordinances or statutes that is being represented. And so we have two main categories of laws in the Torah. You have mishpatim, you have the mishpat, and you have the chukim. So you have the mishpatim and the chukim. So they're two completely different categories, although the end result is the same, obedience, right? We want to look at obeying our Creator. When we look at the scriptures and how to bring sanctity. We talked about kedushim in the past weeks. We talked about holiness, right? We talked about how to approach our Creator. We talked about how to be in covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to be in covenant with the Creator of the universe. When Messiah says in Matthew 5, I've not come to abolish the law or the prophets, I've come to fulfill it. That word pleru in Greek means to uphold it, to raise it up, to elevate it almost to a whole other standard of living, and not completely do away with it. So I wanted to talk real quickly with you about these chukim and mishpatim. And so the mishpatim are commandments that basically have a almost common sense understanding where, do not murder. We understand that it's bad to murder, almost in the sense that even if we didn't have the commandments, we probably wouldn't do them, or we would probably obey them, because they're pretty logical commands, things that are just good for us to do, to take care of our parents and honor your father and mother and do not murder, do not steal. And although there's abuses in all these areas, the majority of us would probably not engage in those kind of activities anyway, because we all know, like, just good people, right? We all know people that they're not religious, or they say I'm not don't put me in the religious category, but they're good people. They do good things on this earth. They don't murder, they don't steal, these things. So that's kind of the category of mishpatim. It's the logical commands that God gives, and they're there just to ensure that we know they exist, but chances are we would probably obey them anyway. Chukim, though, on the other hand, are supra natural, if you will, supernatural laws. They're laws that are given, commandments that are given down, that we many times may not understand why it was given. And so although we can't blanket, and so this is, I want to get into a thought, or I want to get into a concept in a minute, but the overall definition of these categories is this, right? The overall categories of mishpatim and chukim is very logical, very easy. The sages tell us that it's made of course, God designed us. He is the creator of heaven and earth, and so he knows how our mindsets work, how our brains work. And many of the things that are rational to us, we will do anyway. But where we struggle is in the supra. We struggle in those things that aren't rational, those things that maybe don't click, and it's harder for us to obey because we want to understand many times first before we obey. And this is an area of vulnerability that God has created in us that he wants us to explore and he wants us to address in our lives, because there's fullness and abundance in obedience. There's fullness and abundance in the relationship that we can have with our Creator, but we have to get beyond ourselves, right? We have to get beyond our own ideologies, our own mindset, our own human nature of wanting it to make sense to us, because God doesn't always make sense to us, right? This is why when Moses comes to him on the mountain before he frees or goes to Pharaoh in Egypt and at the burning bush, and he says, Lord, who will I say sends me to deliver the Israelites? He says, in Hebrew, Echye asher echye, in Hebrew many times translated, I am he that I am, but really is I will be that which I will be. Again, he's saying, don't box me in, don't put me in a box, is I am the creator of the universe, and I will be that which I will be whenever I need to be it. And so in our mindset, we always want to rationalize things, and we always want to put God into our box of what we really believe and think is the truth. And we've got to be very careful about this because we can enter into this concept, and there's this commandment, if you will. It's not so much a commandment, biblical command, in the sense you can actually, well, let's walk this through, right? So there's a concept in Judaism called Doresh Ta'amad Dekra, which is that we are not allowed, if you will, to try to define the exact definition of a commandment to ensure that we don't fall into the area of not obeying or not entering into fullness in an area of a command because of what we think the command actually means. So for example, one of the examples that's given is the scriptures say that we should not take collateral from a widow that is in need. So a widow that's in need comes and asks, for a loan, asks for money or something of the sort. And so the Torah says you're not to take collateral from her. You're not to take things back. It doesn't explain why we're not to. It just says don't do this. It just says you take care of the widow. So where we could fall into a trap is, well, let's figure out why the Torah says we should not do this. And so we could logically think, because in our logical mind we're going to try to rationalize it, and we're going to say, well, if it's a widow in need, then if I take collateral from her, then what happens if down the road the widow actually needs that item that I just took collateral for, but yet she's in need and can't afford to get another one, and so therefore I don't take the collateral from her just in case she needs that item later on down the road. But then by default, our logical thought process would then say, if a widow that's not in need or has a lot of physical possessions and yet still needs a loan at some point in time, that I would take collateral from her because she's not in need, because she does have physical possessions, and so I wouldn't, she wouldn't need that. So you see how we can go down this path of trying to get into, and this is where logical fallacies enter into our thought processes of trying to determine for the Torah what it means. And so where we fall short in many of these things is in these categories of the chukim, where we attempt to rationalize why the Word of God says what it says, rather than just probably understanding and knowing that if God says it, it's probably best for us. If He's saying to do these things, then we do these things across the board, and not try to make caveats or little asterisks to the Word of God and say, well, this is what it means here, or this is what it means there. Why don't we let the Word of God be sovereign and allow the Word of God to mean what it means? And so this concept of Doresh Ta'amad Dekra is just that. It is in the area, especially of the Chukim. But even the Mishka Team, there's many of these types of commandments that sometimes, we just don't understand and we don't get. And with God being a sovereign God, he doesn't require us to get it. He requires us to give him his heart. He requires us to be all in. And so I just want to encourage you this week to really consider to check and balance your walk. Check and balance. I mean, I hear all the time, well, these commands, a lot of times these commands are applicable to men. Maybe there's a prohibition to men. And then by default, then since the Torah is kind of vague, maybe, or even the New Testament is kind of vague, maybe in another area, we try to logically connect, we try to rationalize and say, well, this only applies to women and this only applies to men. Yes, there are gender-specific commandments, there are gender-specific things in the scriptures, but where they are not necessarily gender-specific, we need to be very careful in entering into this rationalization of, well, this is what it means and it only means that for this person and it doesn't mean it for this person. I think righteousness across the board is not gender specific. Righteousness across the board is about his people serving in a righteous manner, and most importantly, going out, taking care of the poor, the widows, the orphans, the needy, turning our obedience into becoming the likeness of Messiah. Like, what did he say? Yeshua said, if you love me, keep my commandments, follow me, do the will of my Father, just as I do his will, follow me, right? And so there's just a slippery slope there in between this concept of, first, you can either throw the whole thing out and say, well, the law is done away with, and so you're getting rid of all these other categories of commands that are good for us, that we know are not right. And many people rationalize and say, well, it's in society, we wouldn't do these things anyway. No, they're God-given Mishka Team, they're God-given ordinances, statutes, decrees. There's these varying categories of things that God has given us to obey so that we can, not for justification, but so that we can exhibit the righteousness of our King, who requires his people to be holy, just as he says, be holy for I am holy. So there's that slippery slope there in the middle of trying to rationalize these different commandments and think that we've got him all figured out. And I would submit to you that none of us have him all figured out. It is a lifelong journey of sanctification, of dedication, and being the example, being the light in the world, being the salt of the earth. And so I think we need to focus more on actually walking the word out, actually putting our actions ahead of what we think we know, and especially when we get into areas of trying to rationalize what God is really saying. I think it would be better for us, it would more benefit us and the world around us if we just lived the simple words of what God has given us to carry out day in and day out, and spread the love of our Messiah. So I pray you have a blessed week. Thank you for joining in with us on Torah Tuesday. Share, like, comment if this has blessed you. And remember, ask your questions in the comments below. We'll be happy to incorporate them in future episodes. Shavua Tov.